안녕하십니까 여러분, 돌돌콩입니다. 오늘은 굉장히 특별한 인터뷰를 한 편 준비를 했습니다. 영국의 임페리얼 컬리지 런던에서 Surgical Education, 그러니까 외과의 교육을 전공하고 계신 닥터 로저 니본을 인터뷰를 했는데요. 진짜 이런 일이 있구나 싶어가지고 저도 인터뷰를 하면서 너무 설렜고 또 긴장도 좀 됐고 떨리기도 했던 그런 시간이었는데요. 여러분들과 빨리 나누고 싶네요. 닥터 니본이 특히 그 전문가에 대해서 굉장히 관심이 많으신데, 전문가는 어떻게 전문가가 되는가, 그리고 사실 전문가라고 하면 막 엄청난 일을 하는 특정 직업을 생각하기가 굉장히 쉽잖아요. 예를 들어서 복잡한 수술을 해내는 외과 의사라든지, 아니면 막 굉장히 큰 비행기를 조종하는 파일럿이랄지, 아니면 굉장히 어려운 곡을 소화해내는 피아노 연주자랄지, 그런 사람들을 생각을 하기가 쉬운데 사실 그뿐만이 아니라 우리 주위를 둘러보면 평소에 잘 보이지 않아도 각 영역에서 본인의 일을 아주 능숙하게 해내는 전문가들이 굉장히 많다. 그리고 그 전문가들이 우리에겐 왜 필요한지, 거기에서 끝나지 않고 왜 우리에게 있어서 전문가가 되는 여정을 떠나는 게 중요한지, 그게 사실 커리어가 될 수도 있지만 꼭 커리어가 아니더라도 우리가 일상생활에서 맡고 있는 일들, 혹은 우리가 매일 하는 일들, 혹은 취미 생활에서 무언가를 우리가 점점점 개선시켜 나가고 전문가가 되고 그 여정을 떠나는 일이 우리 삶에서 왜 중요한지에 관한 이야기를 하고 계시는 분이세요. 그 이야기를 담은 책 엑스퍼트가 작년에 영국에서 출간이 됐는데, 이 책이 한국에서 일의 감각이라는 제목으로 정말 최근에 출간이 됐습니다. 따끈따끈한 책이고 표지도 너무 예쁘죠. 인터뷰를 준비하면서 또 책을 읽으면서 사실 어떻게 보면 인생의 대선배님이신데, 그 선배님께서 들려주시는 이야기, 그리고 나눠주시는 통찰의 그 깊이랄지 울림이랄지 그 매력에 저도 한참 빠져 있었던 것 같아요. 그리고 인터뷰를 하고 나서도 한 이틀 동안 그 여운에서 빠져나오지 못했는데, 나한테 있어서 내 커리어는 어떤 의미지? 나는 어떤 태도로 그 일을 해나가고 있지라는 생각도 많이 했던 것 같고, 꼭 커리어가 아니더라도 나는 아직 젊고 살 날이 이렇게 많은데 앞으로의 삶을 어떻게 채워나가고 만들어 나갈 것인가에 대해서 조금 이렇게 차분하게 생각해 볼 수 있었던 시간인 것 같아요. 그래서 이 인터뷰를 여러분들과 나눌 것이 너무나 기대가 되고요. 더 관심이 있으신 분들은 닥터 니본의 저서 엑스퍼트, 그리고 한국에서 이제 번역되어 나오기를 일의 감각 이라는 책으로 번역이 되어 나와 있는데, 윌북에서 이 책을 미국까지 보내주셨어요. 너무 감사하죠. 관심이 있으신 분들은 읽어보시면 너무나 좋을 것 같습니다. Have you seen your book in Korean version?
No, I haven't.
So this is the Korean version of your book.
Is it?
I
Oh,
got a
excellent.
copy. So the cover is a little bit different. I like the original
Yes,
cover too.
because
Yeah.
that's my original cover. Yes,
Yeah, I really like the cover too, but I also like this cover. So
that's
there's a
very nice. I
knot,
like that.
and then it becomes
Yes,
prettier, and then becomes a perfect, knots in the end.
that's very nice. I
Yeah.
like that.
And before we get started talking about the book, I just want to take a little bit of time to get to know a little more about you. I'm
Yes.
curious about your story. You briefly
Yes.
mentioned your story here and there in the book, and it was really fascinating. But where did you grow up, and what were you like as a kid, and how and why did you get into medicine in the first place, and how was your journey from there?
Well, I grew up in London, and I'm an only child, so I grew up with my parents in central London. I went into medicine without really knowing what it would be like. I think all of the things that most attract me to medicine, which are the sort of human aspects, only came out later. So to begin with, I didn't find the medical school curriculum particularly absorbing. I went to university in Scotland, in St Andrews University, which is a very long way from London, and very different. It's a very small university town. And I was there for 3 years, and then doing the, as it was called at the time, the preclinical part of the course, which was learning about anatomy and physiology and biochemistry, all those things, without seeing any patients. And then after those 3 years, I moved to a different university, Manchester University, in the central part of England, a very big city, not quite as big as London, but pretty big. And there I was working in hospitals, and I was, for the first time, beginning to work with patients. And from that point on, I suppose I began to find medicine more and more fascinating. as I got involved in the human side and the working with people and the learning, not only learning about diseases, but learning how to care for people and how to do clinical procedures, all that sort of thing. Once I qualified, once I became a doctor, after my first year working in hospital, I then decided to study surgery, and that involved, first of all, spending a year teaching anatomy to medical students. And then I had the opportunity to go abroad, to go to Africa, Southern Africa. And so I did that for a year, as I thought it was going to be in the first instance, but 1 year turned into 2 and 2 years turned into 5. Yeah. And I ended up being in Africa and completing my training as a surgeon over there. And then I had a complete change of direction. And after I'd finished that training, I came back to this country and I retrained as a family doctor. And it's completely different. So in my case, I was working in a group of 7 of us, 7 doctors and a lot of nurses and other members of the team. Completely different, but equally interesting. And then I became particularly interested in teaching other people about medicine, and particularly teaching people to become family doctors. And I did that work for almost over 15 years. Wow. Actually, yes, quite a long time. And at the time, I was becoming more and more interested in education. I'd always been interested in education. So I did a PhD in educational approaches in the world of surgery. And then one thing led to another. And in the third stage of my career, I joined Imperial College London, which is one of the big London universities, and really developed the field of surgical education.
So moving on to your book, so Expert. What's your definition of expert, and why is it so important, you think, for a person to be an expert? So that was my question. And I remember that you said in the book that being an expert is at the core of being human. Can you explain a little bit more about that?
Being expert is actually surprisingly hard to define. I think it's sometimes easier to recognize than it is to describe. But I think that one of the things that's very clear is that becoming expert, it's a process of development. It's not a binary thing where you're either expert or you're not. It's a progression, I think. And in the book, I've divided that up into stages, which we can talk about. But I think that one of the most powerful things that came to me is that it takes just a very long time to become expert, because being expert is not only about developing component skills or knowledge, it's about an internal process that results in your having wisdom. Right. And that involves going through it's a sort of ontological process. I think you have to go through a series of steps that include bad things happening and learning how to put them right, and dealing with the unexpected, all sorts of things, where you have to build up a lot of personal experience and internalize it and make sense of it before you can get to the point where you can be expert in the sense not only of being very good at what you do, but being able to help other people. It's a really important concept for us all to think about, partly because we are, all of us, I think, along that path in one way or another to becoming expert ourselves. And so it's very helpful to understand that path and have a sense of where we've got to and how far we still might have to go. But also because we need to make judgments about other people whom we need to be expert for the things that they can do and we can't, but we need. Right. So if we're flying to another country, we want to know that the person flying the aeroplane is expert, not just that they say they're expert, but that they actually are. But I think it's equally the case with people who do the other things that we need. You know, when we have things going wrong with our house, or we need a wall to be plastered, or a car to be fixed, or whatever. There's just as much scope for people being expert there as there is in these areas that people more usually think of as elite experts. And I think one of the dangers is of conflating the social value we place on particular occupations, because you can be just as expert, if not more expert, in the way that I think about it, as a garage mechanic or financial advisor, as you are if you're a concert pianist or a combat pilot. And yet I think the way society sort of frames these things makes us think that fighter pilots and concert pianists are more expert than garage mechanics and plasterer. In the book, I give examples of over 20 experts, and I've worked with far more than that. And almost all of the really expert ones, when you ask them about it, they say, well, I don't know if I'm really expert.
I mean, that's one of my favorite quotes from your book. Like, you actually never get there. And then you said, like, the sense of never being finished is really hard, right, of becoming an expert.
Yes.
I really like that. Yeah.
I think so. And it is interesting, this idea of a path that goes upwards but doesn't have an end.
Right. Yeah.
I think it's an interesting one because you may be able to point out sort of an area where you start, but you can't ever say it's finished.
Right. You mentioned this process of becoming an expert, and then there are 3 stages in your book, obviously: apprentice stage, journeyman stage, and expert stage, right? So let's talk a little bit more about that. So could you give an example and walk us through each of those 3 stages? Yeah.
So I've used these stages because I'm not sure if these would make sense to a Korean audience or readership so much, but
We'll see.
but
All right.
in European cultures, there's this long-standing, centuries-old model which dates from the medieval guilds, where craftsmen went through a series of stages. And to begin with, they were an apprentice, which meant that for years, often 5 or 10 years, they would just be doing work in a master's workshop, whether they were learning to be stone carvers or tailors or learning to do stuff that was already done, but that they didn't yet know how to do it. Once they'd finished that stage and they were good enough, they went out into the world and they travelled across their country. They went on a journey, and so they were called journeymen. That term is widely understood, certainly I think in Western Europe at any rate, as marking a stage where you go out, you have become independent. You've become sufficiently good at your craft to go out and earn a living on your own by doing it. And then after you've done that for a number of years, you would be sufficiently experienced to set up your own workshop somewhere and then have apprentices of your own. And then come full circle, and then people would come and then they would spend years and years doing what you told them. This sort of 3-stage model has, I think, it has a sort of simplicity that people can understand, where you start off not knowing nothing and doing what you're told, you become independent, you do it on your own, and then you hand it on to somebody else. But I think the problem with that is that it is a descriptive model, not an explanatory one. So it tells you what it looks like from the outside, but it doesn't tell you what it feels like from the inside. And so what I've done in the book is to try and unpack what is the inside story that people go through at each of these stages. And I've divided the stages up into subcategories, which we can talk about. And to do that, I've sort of tried to weave together 3 strands. I've used examples of what it looks like from the outside of experts I've had the privilege of working with, lots of people. So they are they give me an insight and the opportunity to talk to people who've been through that pathway of what they went through to get there. The other bit I think is very important is the inside story. You can only ever know that about yourself, because that's the stuff that you've experienced that you may not tell other people, or you may not be able to put into words, but you've experienced it. And so for that, I include experiences from my own life, both professionally, in terms of being a doctor, a surgeon, then a GP, family doctor, then an academic teaching other people, but also other areas of my life that I've been, interested in. And those have given me, I think, useful insights, particularly into those times when things go badly wrong, which happen to everybody, but not everybody likes to tell you about those.
I have so many follow-up questions about each stage. Let's just start with this. Obviously, it takes a lot of time to become an expert, and it just takes great efforts. And I wonder if that means that you have to start at a very early age to become an expert.
Let's turn it round the other way. I think anyone who sets out to become an expert at whatever stage they think they've started, it actually started a lot
Yeah, earlier,
Earlier things.
yeah.
Because in order becoming expert involves working with other people, and it involves doing things with your hands. And you know, everybody has started doing that from being a baby onwards, and we develop these social skills and these psychomotor skills and all these skills. And that's why I think it's so important to have the opportunity to do all those things from being an infant to going through the different stages of schooling,
Right.
and to have as rich a possibility, a rich an experience as we can in not only learning cognitive things, but in doing things and performing and doing stuff, because we never know which of those things we will need to use as a springboard for what we decide to do
Right.
next. And when you track it back, you find that almost all of the people who are really good at something, you know, they for a long time before they started any formal training, they were doing things with their hands, or they were doing things of this way or that way.
Actually, that was my follow-up question. So one of my question was about how we discovered the field that is worth our long-term commitment to become an expert. Would you recommend, for example, to expose ourselves to various fields to discover that? Like, what's your recommendation for people?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
I mean, I think it depends on whether you're. I mean, some people know from the beginning, don't they?
Right.
That
I
that they want
admire
to
those
be
people,
an
yeah.
Olympic pole vaulter or
Right.
something like that, you know, and that's all they've ever wanted to do, or a guitarist, or you know, something like that.
Right.
Other people, I think, respond to a more exploratory experience, and I think it's certainly in my own case I found that, or move, and some there's a trade-off. I think, you know, if you want to become the greatest living expert the world has ever known in something, then you probably have to focus quite a lot from early on and stick with it for a very long time. But a lot of people get very good at a lot of things, and as I said earlier, we are all somewhere on that path towards becoming expert. And if we understand that, we can make sensible choices about where we want to direct our energies.
Yeah.
One of the deceptive things is that people who are very good at something make it look so easy that you can easily underestimate the time it's going to take you to get as good as they are, if you ever do.
That's for sure.
Actually, one of the tailor I mentioned told me a very interesting his experience. He was at university studying economics when halfway through his undergraduate course he decided that wasn't for him and he wanted to become a tailor. So he dropped out of university and he became apprenticed to a tailor making jackets. And he said, unlike at university where you learn a concept and then fairly quickly, once you've learned that, you go on to the next concept and the next one. When he became a tailor, he could understand pretty much from the beginning what the work involved, what he needed to do. But it took him years before he was able to do it. And so the cognitive and the physical were out of sync. And it was very frustrating to him to begin with, because he was used to making rapid progress in a course of study, you know, intellectual study. But with these physical things, it just took ages and ages, literally years, before he became sufficiently skilled to be able to do it. And I think that that's something really interesting about when you go into a craft-based specialty, whether it's medical or scientific or in the visual or the visual arts or whatever, because it is so easy to underestimate the time it's going to take to be actually able to do it well enough for it to fit into your overall trajectory.
That's absolutely true. And like from outside, when we look at experts, it looks cool and it looks easy and it looks fun, but it's not all the way like that. And that's kind of very overlooked, I think, by a lot of people.
Yeah,
takes
and it isn't fun. And it's a lot of people give up, don't they?
Right.
At the early stages, and they give up. I mean, you could have very good reasons for giving up. You might try something and just not like it. But if you give up simply because you're not mastering it as quickly, you're not getting it as quickly as you hoped, that's probably not a good reason to give up, because actually, whatever it is, if it's worth doing, if there's enough in it to keep your interest for a long time, it's going to take a long time to get the basics.
There are many reasons that I like this book, but I think one big reason was like it really normalized that long journey and some difficulties on the way. It just like really highlights that that's normal. That happens to a lot of people. Actually, it's a requirement to become an expert. And I really felt encouraged by reading this. Oh, okay, yeah, I'm on the way, and it's not wrong pathway.
Well, I'm very glad you felt encouraged, Sunny, because I think that it's easy to be discouraged when things take a long time. And I mean, one of the reasons I mentioned that bit about the boring, repetitive work of no apparent value at the time in the early stage, the apprentice stage, is that, that's natural. It's natural. I mean, it's inevitable. You have to go through it. It's natural to find it boring, but you just have to push through it. I mean, one of the very interesting things that the magician that I've been working with said was that these days with tricks, particularly, quite difficult, demanding tricks, YouTube videos, there are millions of YouTube videos, and by practicing those things for, a few months, you can become extraordinarily good. And there are many very, very young people who do amazing things with their hands. And you can think that if you do that, you've learned, you've mastered, you've become a magician. But the magician talks about that as learning from the elbows down, by which he means that's just one part of it, because actually the crucial bit is how you work with your audience to make them believe that how you perform, in other words. And so you can be an excellent technician, but actually be no good as a magician because you haven't learned how to perform from the elbows up. And that's the bit, that's the human bit that I've talked about, that where most of the challenge lies, I think, because actually learning component skills, I mean, it may not be easy, but it's certainly doable. But that doesn't mean that you've put it all together, or that you can still make the audience have a good experience when you drop your cards by mistake, or when somebody chooses a card and they forget which one they've chosen, or you get somebody to come up and pick a card and you find they've forgotten their glasses and they can't read it. All these things that can happen and do happen. You only get to the point where you can seamlessly make that part of an experience that works for the audience when you've spent a lot of time doing it. And you don't get that from YouTube videos. And that's not to say that YouTube videos don't have a place. Of course they do. But they're only one part of a story. But it's easy to be seduced into thinking that is the whole story, not just one part of it.
There are jobs that don't require audience. For example, I'm a statistician. Mostly I work with computer, with data. Maybe we have an impact and it will benefit some people in the end. The research that we do, the code that we write may benefit some people somehow, but it's kind of like invisible at the moment of working, right? How do we apply these things for that kind of knowledge work setting?
Well, I think there are different kinds of audience. One is the audience that's there in front of you, if you're playing a musical instrument or whatever. But you can have an asynchronous audience. You can have an audience who only experiences your work afterwards. If you make a wood carving or a teapot, somebody may only see it long after you've made it. And I think perhaps the same goes for writing computer code or coming up with statistical approaches for analysing or designing research trials or whatever it might happen to be. Just because there's nobody with you while you're doing it doesn't mean there isn't an audience, or that there aren't people whom your work affects. And I think those are your audience. And they may only be responding or witnessing or responding to your work later,
Right.
maybe when you publish it in a journal or whatever it might happen to be. Does that make sense to
Yeah,
you?
that makes sense. I should just remind myself that audience is there. My work has an impact and that it will benefit some people in the end. Since I have one more last question. So I think a lot about like successful, like AKA experts, habits and routines. And you met a lot of experts. You work with a lot of people. Was there any habit or routine that those people have in common, you think? Or mindset or...
Yeah, I think they're all driven by a sense that the work that they are doing is bigger than they are, and that they are in the service of that work rather than the other way around. They don't just see it as a way of making a living, although of course they do need to make a living. Of course I understand that, but there's something about a bigger picture there that they are contributing to, and that's come over very strongly to me from all the experts I've worked in. And it may be that it's a group of people they're working with, or maybe just that it is their field as a whole, that they feel that it's a worthwhile thing to be part of that bigger way of thinking than just that goes beyond just them.
That's so beautiful. Yeah.